Welcome back, everyone. We've come to the end of a very long journey. In fact, it's been 6 months since I first envisioned this. I've created almost 20 videos along the way, and in this very last video, I want to talk about the purpose of the MadCap Plus. Why did I build this thing at all? I'm going to touch upon the configuration of the various different elements, what's inside of the thing. I'll explain a little bit of why I made some of the design decisions that I did based upon some questions that I've been getting from people. And I will cover the actual impact of this device. What did my friend think of it in the end? If you're enjoying my videos, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to keep watching them going forwards. Let's talk about the purpose. My friend is on a quest. It's probably much like the quest that many of us are on. He's an audiophile and a music lover, and he has a very specific idea as to how music should sound when it's played from a very good quality stereo system. And when he listens to a system, if it falls short in some way, he finds that quite frustrating. So he's trying to get a system that is good enough to sound as good as the image in his mind. One thing in particular he wants it to do is have a great sense of PRaT, that is pace, rhythm, and timing. This is a phrase that often came up back in the days of Naim and Lin. I first encountered it in the 90s when I first started becoming an audiophile myself. In his case, this is something where the music is flowing along. You can really feel the rhythm almost like a palpable thing. Ironically, he didn't really want to buy any Naim gear, primarily because Naim gear is very quirky when it comes to connections, and he didn't like the fact that it was not easily interchangeable with other equipment. So he kept resisting and resisting, but eventually he realized he wasn't getting the PRaT that he wanted, and he tried as an experiment the SuperNate3 as a preamp in his system. He'd already chosen all the other gear, but he needed that final little piece to try and get the extra PRaT, and that SuperNate2 showed that you could get more PRaT by choosing a suitable preamp. The problem with the SuperNate3 is that it was a little bit rough sounding. So what he wanted was another Naim preamp, but one that wasn't extremely expensive, yet could give all the PRaT that it did. So he looked back at some of the earlier Naim preamps, because what we had discovered is the later Naim gear seems to have less emphasis on PRaT and more on soundstage, which is something that I've noticed happening in the audio world. For whatever reason, people seem to be moving away from that very rhythmic approach that Naim used to have. I suggested he get an NAC282, which was the first series after the Olive series, which is what I originally had back in the 90s. I mentioned earlier in my videos that Naim preamps require a separate power supply. And for a 282, the best power supply you could get from Naim would be a SuperCap. Problem is, a SuperCap is very expensive. And I knew that I could probably build a power supply that was better than the SuperCap or even the SuperCap DR. Some of you might care to disagree, and that's fine. Ultimately, I knew that I could build something that I thought was just as good for much, much less money, and it would be an interesting project for me, and I could help my friend. So it seemed like a win-win all across. What does a SuperCap do? It's a power supply, or more specifically, 5 power supplies for something like a 282. It provides 2 separate 5-pin DIN sockets, with each of those providing 2 24-volt supplies. So there's 4 supplies there, and there's also an additional 18.5-volt supply that you usually get from an NAPSC. The NAPSC does come with the 282, but why have a separate box when you can put it all in one? And the SuperCap does that. So my first goal is create a power supply that does everything the SuperCap does in that regard. And I chose to call mine a MadCap because there's the SuperCap, the flat cap, the HiCap. Well, this was a mad idea, so MadCap it is. So the MadCap had to do everything that a SuperCap could do and more. It was going to be a MadCap Plus, the plus being audio buffers. I'd been experimenting with Neurochrome universal buffers, and I found that they really improved things when inserted along the signal chain. I suspect the benefits are likely mostly due to impedance matching and improvements in that realm, but regardless, I could hear a difference. So I was going to include 2 additional audio buffers that would act both before the preamp as well as after. Not only would they hopefully improve the sound of the system, but they would also make interconnection with his other components easier than trying to connect directly to the 282, which is a very quirky Naim preamp. Let's take a look at the configuration of the system in terms of all the different components. My apologies for this photo. I took all the video of the various different stages, but I forgot to take pictures at each step along the way. So I don't have a final really good overhead picture of the device. So I grabbed this screen cap. The first thing you'll see are the power sections. You'll see the mains inlet, the soft start module, and a couple of distribution blocks. The Avondale SSM2 is what I decided to use for the soft start module. There are so many transformers inside of this amp that I was concerned that it might actually blow the fuse when you first turn it on. So I decided to include the soft start module. It probably was unnecessary because I'm using EI transformers and they don't tend to cause large gulping of current like a toroid would. But either way, I had one to spare and thought I would include it. It also made switching a little bit easier to turn on the entire device. The next section is the NAPSC, and this is the least important piece of the system. Really, any 18-volt supply would do just fine. With my old NAC102, I just used the surplus 18-volt wall wart, and it was perfectly fine. In this case, I had a spare little transformer and a little regulated supply module that I was able to plug into it to go into the Aviator style output. Next up, we have the real meat and potatoes, the 24-volt supplies. Remember that we have to have 2 separate 5-pin DIN plugs, and each of those has 2 24-volt supplies. The one section you'll see here has 2 of the supplies, and this other section has the other 2. The elements of this took a fair bit of consideration. For transformers, I chose to use EI core rather than toroids. With EIs, there's an air cap between the E and the I laminations that makes them less susceptible to saturation and DC offset. It also has a lower coupling efficiency. It acts a bit like a snubber, filters high frequency noise. It also provides some soft start abilities, better than a toroid does, but because I have a soft start module, that wasn't an issue. There's also lower external EMF for a toroid. It's higher for an EI, but because this particular power supply was going to be separate from all the equipment, that noise was not an issue. For the rectifier, I chose to use an Avondale FWB2. It has SMD Schottky diodes, which are very fast and tend to have low switching noise. For smoothing, I have a pair of capacitors with a choke between. So it's a CLC configuration, electrolytic capacitors and a small choke. There's also a ceramic bypass capacitor in place just to reduce ripple a little bit further. For the regulator, I have the Avondale ASR2 shunt regulator. Now, a shunt regulator is something you don't see very often, and many people consider it to be the Cadillac of regulators. It's not like a normal tracking regulator, which has some sensing time involved. So when it notices the voltage dipping or rising, it has to go ahead and respond to that. It takes a little bit of time. With a shunt regulator, it's a little bit more like a Class A amplifier in that it's always going full tilt. And therefore, any current that's required is just sipped from that full stream, and there's very little delay, if any, for that current to come through, and consequently the voltage never dips. So this is why it tends to work very well. Theoretically, it should be as good as any typical regulator, and that includes Naim's own DR series of regulators. It is, of course, inherently inefficient, but the point here is not efficiency. The point is supply quality. So those are the elements in the 24-volt supplies. So now we've seen the piece that describes the entirety of what a SuperCap would do with the NAPSC and the 5 24-volt supplies. Next up are the audio buffers. I chose to use the Neurochrome Universal Buffer. And the benefit here is that it's very easy to drive. If I recall correctly, it's about 45,000 ohms impedance. which is a fairly straightforward load for anything to drive. But on the output side, the output impedance is exceedingly low. It's less than 1 ohm, might even be less than 1/10 of an ohm output impedance. It's ludicrously low compared to most devices, which tend to have 10 ohms or possibly even 50 ohms output impedance. And I think that's where the magic really comes through. I think that's what makes it work so well. In both of these cases with the Neurochrome universal buffers, I'm using the Neurochrome Preamp power supply, which is tailor-made to go with these buffers and fit in very nicely into this particular project. There are two buffers in play. The input buffer comes before the 282, and it has an XLR input because it'll be fed by the Ferrum Wandla DAC that my friend has, and it sounds better with its XLR output than it does with its RCA. So that made sense in that. And then, of course, the buffer converts from balanced XLR to unbalanced, which is what the 282 needs. There are two outputs for this particular buffer I have set up because the universal buffer can simultaneously drive probably 3 or 4 components without really having difficulty or falling down. So I've got two outputs here, but really we'll only be using one. One is a 5-pin DIN, looking much like a standard Naim source cable, 180-degree DIN plug. The other one is RCA jacks in case he wanted to drive the RCA inputs on his 282. The output buffer goes from the output of the 282 and converts it from a 4-pin DIN from that plug into RCAs for his power amp. So that's how all those things come into play. So now that the thing is built, how did it work? I was able to test it for a while at my own house, and I had his 282 there to confirm that everything was working correctly. One thing I did is compare the MadCap against a flat cap that I happen to have on hand. And Naim's flat cap is its entry-level power supply, other than perhaps the snaps that came prior to that. So a flat cap is just basic LM317 linear regulator in it, nothing too special. And when I compared the two, I tried first of all with just one 5-pin DIN from the MadCap compared to the flat cap, and even with that, the difference was very obvious. I found the flat cap sounded somewhat small and maybe flat. It was very closed in. The inner details seemed somewhat obscured. It just didn't really sound like it wanted to open up and reach and breathe. When I had the MadCap instead, it made a big difference. And then when I connected the second 5-pin plug, that was another big jump again. The 282, if you recall, is able to have either 2 external 24-volt supplies or 4. And it worked out that there was a real benefit with that. Unfortunately, I didn't have a SuperCap to compare it to, but suffice it to say, I was very pleased with what I heard. I tried inserting the buffers just to confirm they were going to work, and it seemed like they were beneficial to me, but I wanted to see what my friend thought of it. First of all, I just hooked it up as a SuperCap without the audio buffers. So we would be going with RCA from his Ferrum into the 282 for its signal, and then we had a special cord so I could go from the 4-pin output of the 282 directly into his RCA amplifier. So all we had was just the 282 by itself with the SuperCap equivalent power supply. And the first thing that we noticed, which was very relieving, was that the PRaT that he had sensed with the Super NAT3 was there just as much, if not more so. So that made him feel very good because he had bought this thing hoping that the 282 would sound as good as the Super NAT3 had. And he was very happy to discover that it was at least that good or better. Next up, we added the Neurochrome universal buffer between the Wandla and the 282. That meant now we could go XLR from the Wandla to the universal buffer, and then we could go 5-pin DIN from the universal buffer into Naim's 282. What was the difference? Well, first of all, it did the same thing that I've heard many times from this universal buffer. It was much fuller, much more confident. The cymbals sounded more live. Jaco Pastorius's bass, when he played it, it just felt more right somehow. It sounded like a real bass guitar. It was bigger, more nuanced, at the same time more delicate. Ani DeFranco, when she was singing, a lot of times her voice can sound very edgy, but suddenly it felt more warm and full and rich. Mark made a comment. He goes, "This makes more sense in my head." And that harked back to this idea that he has this image as to how something should sound. So when he says it makes more sense in my head, it means that it's good enough. We played some jazz, and Christian McBride playing bass just had a swagger that wasn't obvious there at all when it was there before. And that's that pace, rhythm, and timing coming up again. Then it came time to insert the output buffer. And in my own testing at home, I discovered that that second buffer was beneficial, but not nearly as much as the input buffer. But I wanted to see what my friend thought. He commented that there was more tonal clarity, more articulation and separation between the notes, just more open in general. The bass made even more sense than it did before. And we did notice that it seemed like it took away a little bit of the body, but that body was replaced by more textural detail. It was just that much more balanced overall. We also noticed all of a sudden that the sound of this, if it was a symphony that we were listening to, we suddenly realized that we had more of a sense that we were in a hall. The sound of the hall itself became more evident. It wasn't just reverb, it was, no, this is just the way it was echoing around the room, and you felt like you were in that room much more. I guess you could say the soundstage was improved. Interestingly enough, neither buffer increased the pace, rhythm, and timing. In that regard, the 282 did its work. The buffers did not make any change. And I'd noticed this myself as well. I'd often said to my friend that these buffers are very, very beneficial. And he's like, but does it help the PRaT? And I'm like, I don't think so. But overall, when you have the 282 with those buffers in place, with this particular power supply, it was very, very special indeed. Overall, was this a worthwhile benefit? I would say 100%. My friend had tried the SuperNate 3, and it seemed to imply that another Naim preamp could do what he wanted, yet better. And fortunately, the 282 had all the benefits that the SuperNate 3 did, and none of the downsides that that preamp had. My friend is finally happy. He's finally dancing in his couch, very pleased that he has the pace, rhythm, and timing that he knew was in there somewhere. The 282 had the magic, and it benefited from the power supply and the audio buffers, helping things along as well. Just made everything work a little bit better, both sonically and from a connection perspective. I'd like to thank everyone who's watched all the videos in this particular series, because there were a lot of them. And some of them were just me ruminating on, well, what's the best way? Should I do it this way or that way? And as a verbal processor, that was very helpful along the way. And thank you for sticking through it. For those who have just hopped in here and there, I'm glad to see you there as well. I was so impressed with my friend's system when it was done that I've actually acquired an older NAC82 myself. And I'm going to be playing with various different power supplies. I don't know if it's going to be another MadCap or not, but it's been fun for me, and I plan to keep doing so. Have yourself a great day.